Today, we're doing a deep dive, a really detailed forensic analysis of a scholarly commentary on the Quran's 28th chapter, Surah Al-Qasas. We're going to focus in on verses 56 through 67, and our whole goal here is to methodically unpack every single layer of the commentator's argument, piece by piece, so we can see the full theological picture they're painting. All right, let's get into it. Now, for this entire analysis, our one and only source is a transcript from the lessons of Ayatollah Javadia Moli. We're going to treat this text as our primary document. That means we're committed to examining the commentator's specific arguments, their proofs, and their conclusions exactly as they are laid out, without summarizing or skipping anything. So here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the concept of divine guidance. Then, we'll examine the very worldly arguments of the Qur'an and the divine rebuttal. From there, we'll dive into the stark contrast between the material world and the hereafter, witness the dramatic scenes on the Day of Judgment, and finally, we'll synthesize the core principles of divine justice that the commentator draws from this entire passage. Okay, let's begin. The commentator starts us off by zooming in on a really foundational concept, hidayah, which means guidance. And the entry point, the key that unlocks this whole discussion, is verse 56. A verse that speaks directly to the Prophet Muhammad himself. This verse is absolutely pivotal. According to the commentator, this one line establishes a critical theological distinction. Now, it's not saying that the Prophet has no role in guidance, not at all. What it's doing is setting up the idea that guidance actually comes in two very distinct forms, and this framework is essential for understanding everything that follows. And here is that crucial distinction laid bare. On the one hand, you've got guidance as showing the way. This is the job of the prophets. They lay out the arguments, they teach the path, they give you the map. But on the other hand, there's guidance as delivering to the destination. The commentator argues this is an act that belongs exclusively to God. It's an internal change, a direct delivery to the goal that is simply beyond any human's power to perform. Okay, so if that ultimate guidance, the delivery to the destination, is from God, then why do people reject the map in the first place? Well, the commentary now shifts gears to explore the very practical, very worldly arguments that the leaders of Mecca, the Quraysh, were making to justify turning away from the message. Their number one concern wasn't some abstract theological issue. No, it was all about power, security, and economics. They were genuinely afraid that if they joined this new movement, it would upset the regional balance of power. They thought they'd be attacked, overthrown, and in the literal words of the verse, swept from their land. But the divine rebuttal, as the commentator breaks it down, completely pulls the rug out from under that argument. The verse asks them, essentially, hold on, didn't we already establish Mecca as a safe sanctuary, a haram amin? This security, the very foundation of their trade and prosperity, which brought the fruits of all things to their city, was a divine gift that they had long before Islam came. The commentator concludes, their fear was just a pretext, a cover story. The verse diagnoses the real problem. It wasn't a risk assessment, it was a fundamental ignorance of who had been providing their security all along. This leads the commentator to put a spotlight on a key term from the very next verse, Batsarat ma'ishataha. This isn't just about being wealthy. It describes a specific spiritual state, an arrogant, ungrateful, over-the-top extravagance that comes from being blessed. The text makes it crystal clear that destruction is not a punishment for having prosperity. It's a consequence of this spiritual disease of insolence and wastefulness. And then the commentator explains how the verses lay out a divine sunnah, that is, God's consistent, established practice when it comes to the fate of entire civilizations. It isn't arbitrary. There are conditions. First, a messenger has to be sent to the main population center, the mother city, with a clear warning. Second, destruction only happens if the people are persistent wrongdoers, or zalimun. The verse then points to the physical proof, the ruins of their cities, and ends with this profound statement on impermanence. At the end of the day, God is the one who inherits everything. This idea of impermanence leads us straight into the core philosophical contrast of the passage. The commentator now does a close forensic analysis of how the Quran frames the value of this worldly life versus the reality of the hereafter. And the precision of the language here is just striking. This worldly life is called mata, a temporary provision, a fleeting enjoyment. And it's called zinatuha, its superficial decoration. But in stark contrast, what is with God is described with two simple, yet incredibly powerful words. Khair,
which means it's fundamentally better in its very essence, and abqa, which means it's more lasting. In fact, it's eternal.
Then the commentary presents this verse as this powerful rhetorical question aimed squarely at our faculty of reason. It forces us to compare two people. Person A has a guaranteed, excellent promise that he will receive. Person B gets the temporary funds this world, but then he's brought forth for punishment. Are those two people really equal? And right here is where the commentator drives the point home. The verse ends with the phrase, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, then will you not use reason? The point being made isn't about blind faith. It's an appeal to pure logic. Reason itself dictates that what is eternal and superior is a better investment than what is temporary and fleeting. This brings us to the climax of the passage. We're now moving into the depiction of the Day of Judgment, the moment where the consequences of all these worldly choices and priorities are finally and irrevocably laid bare. The commentator walks us through an absolutely dramatic sequence of events. First, the divine call rings out, challenging the polytheists. Where are those partners you used to claim existed? Then, the great betrayal. The very leaders who led people astray completely disown their followers. A test is given. Go on, call your partners for help. But of course, there's only silence. And finally, when they're hit with the ultimate question, what was your response to the messengers? The verse says all information is obscured from them. They're struck silent, unable to answer, or even ask each other for help. And this quote just captures that moment of ultimate betrayal. This is the declaration from those who were followed into error. They completely washed their hands of their followers, essentially telling God, we have nothing to do with them, whatever they were worshiping, it wasn't us. The commentator highlights this as the total breakdown of all false allegiances, revealing their absolute uselessness when true authority finally appears. So now we've arrived at the synthesis, and this isn't just a quick summary. This is the final presentation of the complete, coherent theological argument that the commentator has been meticulously building for us, verse by verse, through this whole section of Surah Al-Qasas. So what are the core ideas that emerge from this entire analysis? First, that the highest form of guidance, hidayah, is purely a divine act. Second, that real, lasting security is a gift from God, not something you get from politics or power. Third, that civilizations don't fall because of poverty, but because of injustice and arrogant ingratitude. Fourth, that simple reason affirms that the eternal hereafter is superior to this temporary world. And finally, that associating partners with God results in nothing but total powerlessness and abandonment on the Day of Judgment. But it's not all about condemnation. The commentator makes a point to show that verse 67 provides the explicit, actionable way out, the path to success, to avoid the fate we've just seen. And it's a clear three-part formula: to repent, teba, to truly believe, amana, and to do good, righteous deeds, amila saliyah. And so we conclude with this final, encapsulating question that really emerges from the commentator's entire analysis. The verses draw a sharp contrast between two groups: those who are min al-muhaddarin, the ones brought forth for punishment, and those who are min al-muflihin, the successful ones. Based on everything the commentary has laid out for us, what is the fundamental distinction, the core difference in choice and action that ultimately separates these two final destinies? The text leaves us to reflect